The outer monitoring station was the kind of assignment officers joked about back at the academy, the place where careers went quiet and nothing ever happened, orbiting a dead stretch of space so empty it barely registered on galactic maps. And Lieutenant Siren had drawn the short straw. She sat alone in the command ring, long hours into a night shift that felt endless, surrounded by softly humming consoles and star charts that hadn't changed in centuries, sipping recycled stimulant, and reviewing sensor logs she already knew by heart. This sector was considered stable, harmless, forgotten, which was exactly why rookies and low-priority officers were sent here, because legends didn't belong in places like this, and threats certainly didn't either. Humans, especially, were a topic reserved for history lectures and exaggerations, a footnote in ancient conflicts that most modern citizens believed had been mythologized beyond reason, stories told to scare cadets into respecting protocols. Siren had always thought the same, that no species truly vanished and no enemy was ever as terrifying as propaganda made them sound. And as she leaned back in her command chair, eyes half focused on the radar sweep, she fully expected this shift to end like every other one, quietly, uneventfully, forgettable. That was when the sensor grid refreshed, hesitated for half a second longer than normal, and painted a return that did not belong, a signal so dense and so wrong that her console flagged it 3 times before her brain caught up. And in that instant, before alarms even sounded, Siren felt something she hadn't felt since her first day in uniform, pure, instinctive dread, because deep in the archived memory of forbidden briefings and redacted lessons, she recognized the pattern. The system was trying not to say out loud. Siren leaned forward slowly, every trace of boredom wiped from her mind as she brought the sensor display into full focus, her fingers moving with trained precision even as her pulse began to climb, because the return on her screen wasn't behaving like any ship she'd ever tracked. It wasn't flickering like debris, it wasn't pulsing like a scout probe, and it definitely wasn't broadcasting an identification ping. Instead, it sat there, heavy and unwavering, as if space itself had decided to grow a heartbeat. The computer attempted an automatic classification and failed, then tried again using legacy databases, digging deeper into records most officers never accessed. And when even that came back blank, a soft warning tone echoed through the command ring, subtle but unmistakable. Siren swallowed and initiated a manual scan, widening the range and slowing the sweep. And that was when the numbers started to make her uncomfortable, because the mass reading was far too high for the object's apparent size and the energy. Output was nearly non-existent, a combination that violated everything modern engineering understood. Any ship that dense should have been screaming with power signatures, yet this one moved with a quiet, deliberate drift that felt less like navigation and more like patience. She checked the distance again, hoping for a sensor ghost or a calibration error, but the object was already inside long-range monitoring distance, closing slowly, deliberately, as if it had known exactly where the station was long before her radar ever found it. Siren glanced toward the silent command chair beside her, suddenly aware of how alone she was, and for the first time since taking this assignment, she considered waking the command staff early, because whatever was out there wasn't lost, wasn't broken, and wasn't wandering. And as the system highlighted a single suppressed comparison from a sealed historical archive, her display flickered just long enough to flash a designation that hadn't been used in centuries, a word so heavily restricted it was supposed to be myth. And Siren felt her throat tighten as the screen quietly labeled the contact with one chilling possibility. Siren hesitated only a moment before isolating the contact and routing every available sensor toward it, overriding the station's default filters as the main display shifted from abstract data to a raw visual reconstruction. And what emerged on the screen made her breath catch. The object was not elegant, not symmetrical in the way modern ships were designed to be, but thick, angular, and scarred, its surface layered with dense armor plates that looked less manufactured and more grown through decades of repair and reinforcement. There were no decorative lights, no visible insignias, no attempt at visible communication, just a dark, brutal silhouette cutting through the starfield with the confidence of something that had survived worse than this empty sector. The closer the image refined itself, the more unsettling it became, because the vessel didn't resemble anything built for speed or diplomacy. It resembled a structure meant to endure impact, radiation, and prolonged combat, as if whoever designed it had never expected help to arrive. Siren pulled up comparative schematics, lining the image beside archived alien warships, but the differences were immediate and uncomfortable. Where other species favored sleek hulls and energy shields, this craft relied on mass redundancy and overwhelming durability, a design philosophy that felt old, stubborn, and terrifyingly practical. The station's AI attempted to identify propulsion systems and failed again, flagging unknown alloys and sealed compartments too thick for passive scans. And as Siren studied the battered contours of the hull, she realized this ship wasn't hiding its damage, it was wearing it, like a record of battles fought and survived. And deep in her memory, fragments of Forbidden's Academy lectures began to resurface. Lessons that described human engineering not as advanced, but as relentless. Built by a species that assumed everything would go wrong and planned to keep going anyway. She stared at the screen as the object continued its steady approach. And for the first time, the legend stopped feeling exaggerated, because whatever that ship was, it looked like it had crossed half the galaxy with nothing but refusal to die. Siren's fingers hovered over the console for a long moment before she made a decision she knew could get her in trouble. She opened the sealed archives, a digital vault long forbidden to anyone outside the High Council, the kind of files officers were warned never to access without explicit authorization. The warning banners flashed, red and insistent, but curiosity and instinct overruled protocol, and as the data decrypted, images and recordings began to fill her screen, fragments of battles and campaigns that had been scrubbed from most historical records. There it was, the unmistakable human silhouette, not myth, not speculation, not stories meant to scare cadets, but evidence of a species that had once fought across the stars and vanished without explanation. The footage showed them small in number, outgunned, outnumbered, yet relentless, advancing against fleets built to crush them, using ingenuity, adaptability, and sheer, stubborn endurance that alien strategists had consistently underestimated. Siren scrolled through the catalog, each file deepening the impossibility of it all. Ship schematics that made no sense, tactics that defied conventional logic, and logs of survivors who never surrendered, never begged, never bent. And as her eyes fell on a single entry, the name of the approaching ship appeared in a system warning almost casually, human. The word felt impossibly heavy on her tongue as she leaned back, staring at the blinking radar dot. And for the first time in her career, she understood that legends weren't just exaggerated stories. They were warnings encoded in fear. And now, for the first time in centuries, one had returned. The alert finally reached the command network, a slow, deliberate pulse that carried through every monitoring station in the sector. But Siren could feel it before the official response even arrived. The subtle vibrations in the console, the sudden tightness in her chest, and the way her fingers trembled slightly over the override controls. Messages began arriving, first routine confirmations, then sharp, clipped inquiries from senior officers who hadn't expected any activity tonight, and finally, the silence that carried more weight than words. Siren forwarded the files from the Forbidden's archives along with her readings, but even as the transmission left her station, she felt eyes watching from beyond the network, higher authority analyzing every frame of the human ship she had uncovered. Moments later, The communication channel lit up with the first response from High Command. Terse, fragmented, and almost hesitant. Identify. Classify. Confirm. Now, the message read, but Siren noticed the subtle hesitation in the Velosta. Phrasing, a rare crack in their otherwise precise language. She realized the higher-ups weren't just cautious. They were unsettled. Her console pinged again, and a senior admiral's voice came through the encrypted feed, calm but unnervingly. Still, if it's human, do not engage. The words lingered, almost casual, yet loaded with centuries of history and fear. Siren leaned back, staring at the approaching radar dot as her pulse raced. And for the first time, she understood that the ship she had found wasn't just an anomaly in the data. It was a ghost from a past the galaxy had tried to erase. A presence so improbable that even the most seasoned officers were unsure if survival or catastrophe would follow next. Asterisk. The radar dot loomed closer, and the hum of the station systems seemed to fade beneath the tension pressing down on Siren. Every instinct screamed caution. Every training module she had ever completed screamed protocol, but she was the first human, or rather, the first officer to actually see it in real time. High Command had ordered observation only, but she couldn't resist reaching for the comms, initiating a formal greeting, even as her fingers shook. Unknown vessel. This is Lieutenant Siren, Outer Monitoring Station Delta 9. Identify yourself, she spoke, her voice steady though her heart raced. The transmission went silent for what felt like hours, though in reality it was only minutes, each tick of the clock stretching longer than the last. Then, a single deliberate pulse returned, not words at first, just a pattern almost musical, unlike anything the station had catalogued. The eye struggled to interpret it, flashing warnings and attempting translations, but it soon became clear. The pulse was intentional, intelligent, and calm. Then, finally, the voice came low, measured, and unmistakably human. "We mean no harm," it said. One sentence, but it carried weight that reverberated through Siren's mind. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't negotiation. It was presence, simply being there. She leaned back, gripping her console, and realized that everything the galaxy had taught her about humans, about their supposed extinction and myths, was wrong. Whatever this ship was, it was deliberate, aware, and it was here. Asterisk. As the transmission ended, Siren sat frozen, staring at the radar dot that represented a species the galaxy had long written off as legend. Her fingers hovered over the controls, but she didn't move. The AI began cross-referencing historical records, pulling from the most classified archives, and what appeared on the display made her stomach tighten. Humans had not disappeared because they were defeated. They had been hunted, systematically erased from records and battlefronts. A species so underestimated that every galactic power had assumed extinction was inevitable. And yet, here they were, a lone ship cutting through centuries of erasure, alive and uncompromising. The images in the archives showed their ships battered and patched, never sleek or elegant like alien war vessels, but resilient, brutal in design, and crewed by individuals who adapted faster than any enemy could predict. Humans had survived. Impossible odds, and every tactical record, every journal snippet, every log whispered the same truth. They did not surrender, they did not plead, and they did not forget. Siren's breath caught as she realized what it meant. The ship on her screen was not just a vessel. It was the embodiment of a species that refused to vanish, a species that had waited for this very moment, and now, after centuries, they had returned. The quiet hum of the station seemed almost inadequate against the weight of it. And she understood in that instant that humanity was not a myth, not a story meant to scare cadets, but a presence the galaxy had long feared, and now it was here. The reply came without warning, not as a sudden alarm or an aggressive signal, but as a clean, open-channel transmission that bypassed standard diplomatic protocols, as if the human ship had already mapped the station systems and chosen the simplest path on purpose. Siren straightened in her chair as the audio resolved, half expecting a list of demands or a declaration of intent. But instead, the voice that filled the command ring was calm, unmistakably human, and tired in a way that carried centuries behind it. The speaker did not identify rank or authority, only presence, explaining that they had been traveling the deep routes beyond mapped space, watching the galaxy change, waiting until the noise of old wars faded enough to return without triggering panic. The message wasn't a threat, and it wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact, delivered evenly, as if survival itself had taught them restraint. Siren listened as the voice explained that humanity had learned long ago that being seen too early meant extinction, and that disappearance had been the only way to endure, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. When the transmission ended, the station felt impossibly small, and she realized that the fear surrounding humans had never been about their weapons or numbers, but about their patience, because a species capable of waiting centuries without losing itself was far more dangerous and far more powerful than anyone had ever prepared for. The silence that followed the human transmission felt heavier than any alarm Siren had ever heard, as if the station itself was holding its breath. And she knew without being told that the message had already been relayed far beyond her small monitoring post. Across relay nodes and command hubs, senior officials replayed the recording again and again, not searching for threats, but for tone, for intent, for any hint that the legends had been wrong. Siren watched new data streams flood her console, as High Command quietly elevated the situation from anomaly to historical event, locking down channels and issuing classified directives that avoided a single word, entirely war. The human ship adjusted its course slightly, not toward the station and not away from it, but parallel, maintaining distance with deliberate precision, a silent demonstration of control that unsettled even the most confident strategists. For the first time in centuries, galactic defense models began to fail, because every simulation assumed humans no longer existed, and now those assumptions were crumbling in real time. Siren realized that this moment would be replayed in academies long after she was gone. The instant the galaxy stopped debating whether humans were real and began asking why they had come back, and as she stared at the steady, unthreatening dot on her screen, she understood something chilling and profound. The most frightening thing about the human ship wasn't what it was doing, but what it was choosing not to do. Siren didn't learn the truth from the human ship, but from a set of archival files unlocked by High Command under emergency authorization, records so deeply buried that even their existence had been officially denied. The files told stories stripped of myth and exaggeration. A history of first contact gone wrong when humanity's early exploration triggered fear rather than curiosity, and fear had united the galaxy faster than any treaty ever could. Humans had been labeled unpredictable, dangerously adaptive, and impossible to contain, not because they were the strongest or the most advanced, but because they refused to collapse under pressure the way every other species eventually did. Coalition fleets had moved against them with overwhelming force, expecting a quick resolution, only to discover that humanity responded to extinction-level threats by changing tactics, abandoning territory, and learning at a pace no algorithm could match. The archive showed the final decision clearly. Humanity had not lost the war. They had chosen to disappear, scattering into uncharted regions beyond mapped space, dismantling their presence and erasing their trails, turning survival into strategy. As Siren absorbed the weight of it, she understood that the galaxy hadn't defeated humans. It had forced them to evolve in silence, and now, as the human ship held its steady course outside her station, the question was no longer whether Humanity had survived, but what kind of species centuries of watching and waiting had turned them into? The realization spread through command channels like a slow-moving shockwave, not with panic or raised voices, but with something far more unsettling careful restraint. Siren watched as high-ranking officials revised directives in real time, deleting aggressive contingencies and replacing them with observation protocols that had never been used before. Because the truth was now undeniable. Humanity had not returned in desperation or anger, but by choice. The human ship continued its steady course, maintaining distance, broadcasting no weapons locks, no demands, no threats. And that silence forced the galaxy to confront a reality it had avoided for centuries. Siren reviewed new intelligence, assessments that quietly admitted what older records had tried to hide, that every major power had once benefited from humanity's disappearance, and that none of them had prepared for the day those benefits would come due. As she looked at the data, she understood the unspoken fear rippling through command, not that humans would attack, but that they would remember. A species that survived extinction by patience and observation would not need to announce its return loudly, because simply existing again shifted the balance of power. And as Siren stared at the calm, unwavering signal on her radar, she realized that the galaxy was no longer in control of the narrative, and it hadn't been for a very long time. The next transmission arrived hours later, long enough for tension to harden into expectation. And when it came, it wasn't routed through command channels or diplomatic relays, but sent directly to Siren's station, as if the human ship had chosen her specifically to listen. The voice was the same as before, steady, restrained, unmistakably human, and this time it spoke with clarity about intent, not apology or threat. The message explained that humanity had not returned to reclaim territory, settle old scores, or prove its strength, because those were mistakes younger civilizations made when they confused survival with dominance. Instead, the human speaker stated that they had watched the galaxy fracture, repeat its own cycles of fear, and make the same decisions that once nearly erased them, and that their return was not about power, but about intervention when extinction-level choices were being made again. Siren felt a chill as she realized what that meant, because humans were not presenting themselves as conquerors or allies, but as something far more unsettling, observers who had decided the galaxy had reached a critical point. The message ended without ceremony, simply stating that humanity would no longer hide, and that their presence would be known from now on. Not loudly, not aggressively, but undeniably. As the channel closed and the radar contact remained steady and calm, Siren understood that the most terrifying thing about humanity wasn't what they planned to do, but that they believed they had earned the right to decide when to act. The effects of humanity's declaration rippled outward faster than any fleet ever could, not through explosions or battles, but through sudden shifts in behavior across the galaxy. Defense networks adjusted silently. Border patrols doubled without explanation, and long-dormant treaties were reviewed with an urgency that betrayed deep unease, because no one could pretend anymore that humans were a myth or a problem for the future. Siren watched reports stream in from distant systems where long-simmering conflicts abruptly stalled, not because humanity had intervened directly, but because their presence alone had introduced a new variable no strategist could ignore. Species that had once built their power on overwhelming force now hesitated, uncertain how a civilization shaped by extinction, patience, and observation might respond to reckless escalation. The human ship near her station remained exactly where it was, neither advancing nor retreating, and that restraint unsettled command more than any weapons display ever could, because it suggested confidence born not of numbers, but of certainty. Siren realized that the galaxy had spent centuries assuming humanity was gone and safe to forget, and now it was being forced to confront a more difficult truth, that humans had returned not to dominate the galaxy, but to exist within it. on their own terms, and that alone was enough to change everything. As the hours passed, Siren remained at her post, watching the human ship hold its position with unwavering calm. And slowly it became clear that humanity was waiting, not for permission, but for a response. High Command debated and controlled, silence weighing centuries of fear against the reality unfolding on their screens, because acknowledging humanity meant admitting the past had been wrong. Messages were drafted and discarded, some too cautious, others too aggressive, until at last a single directive reached Siren's station, granting her authority far beyond her rank. She was to deliver the galaxy's answer. Her hands were steady as she opened the channel, aware that this moment would define not just her career, but the future of interstellar relations, and when she spoke, her words were simple, measured, and honest, acknowledging humanity's survival and recognizing their right to exist openly once more. The response from the human ship was immediate, not with celebration or triumph, but with quiet acceptance, as if this outcome had been anticipated all along. Siren exhaled slowly, realizing that the legends had never been about human aggression or conquest, but about endurance and restraint, and that the galaxy's greatest mistake had been assuming silence meant defeat. The human ship finally changed course, not toward the station and not away from it, but forward, resuming its journey deeper into known space with the same quiet confidence it had displayed since the moment it was discovered. And as it moved, long-range sensors across the sector began to light up, not with weapon signatures, but with confirmations of other human vessels emerging from routes the galaxy had never fully mapped. Siren watched in silence as the realization settled across command channels that humanity had never truly been gone, only dispersed, watching, learning, waiting until the galaxy was stable enough or fragile enough to reveal themselves. Again, there were no declarations of dominance, no fleets assembled in formation, no demands issued, and that restraint spoke louder than any show of force ever could, because it meant humanity no longer needed to prove anything. As the final sensor reading stabilized and the first human ship vanished beyond her station's range, Siren understood that the stories told to frightened cadets had been incomplete. Not warnings of monsters, but reminders of a species that endured when extinction was certain and chose patience over vengeance. The galaxy had called them a legend because it was easier than facing the truth, and now that truth was undeniable, humanity had returned, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as a constant presence, and from this moment on, every decision the galaxy made would be measured against one simple, unsettling fact. Humans were real. They had survived, and they were no longer hiding.